Her signature bleeds across the marriage contract, a final, dark blossom of ink. Outside, a lone bird sings a lament. Security, position, my family saved, she thinks. The words a cold comfort against the cavernous silence of his indifference. The ledgers arrayed before him were a testament to a legacy in slow, ignoble decay. His father's reckless wagers, his grandfather's foolish ventures, the crushing weight of it all rested squarely upon his shoulders. At 32, Duke Elias Thorne had learned to keep his heart as cold and as ordered as the columns of figures in those ancient books. Emotion was a currency he could not afford to spend. His dukedom demanded survival, not sentiment. He picked up the contract, his fingers steady, his gaze clinical. He scanned the terms, registering only their practical weight. Dowry, settlements, the clearly defined expectations. Lady Eleanor Vance, 24, unmarried, of a respectable but financially crippled family. Her father, desperate, had not dared to ask for affection, only for salvation. She was, in every respect, the perfect, dispassionate solution to a series of deeply personal problems. The sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive announced her arrival, precisely at 11, as scheduled. Elias did not rise from his desk. He felt no impulse to glance toward the window for a glimpse of his future duchess. What did her appearance matter? She was a means to an end, a vessel for the heir that would secure the Thorne lineage. When his butler, Mr. Finch, showed her into the study, Elias looked up with the same disinterest he might afford a new piece of furniture. Lady Eleanor Vance stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her, her traveling cloak still damp from the autumn mist. She was slight, dressed in a simple gray day dress that seemed to absorb the dreary morning light. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe knot, her eyes downcast, her features arranged in an expression of quiet resignation. Forgettable, he thought, a flicker of cold relief passing through him. She would not be a distraction. Lady Eleanor, he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Please, sit. She moved to the chair opposite him with silent grace. Your father has explained the arrangement. Yes, Your Grace. Her voice was soft, yet steady. It revealed nothing. I understand the terms. Then we need not belabor them. You will manage this household, fulfill all social obligations, and provide an heir. In return, your family's debts will be settled. He slid the contract across the polished expanse of the desk. For the briefest of moments, her eyes lifted to meet his. Gray, he noted absently, like the sky outside. Something flickered in their depths. A shadow of disappointment or perhaps simple acceptance. Then she looked down, took the pen, and signed her name in a neat, controlled hand. The wedding will be in 3 weeks, Elias stated, his attention already returning to his ledgers. Mr. Finch will coordinate with your family. You may go. She rose, curtsied, a gesture he barely acknowledged, and left as quietly as she had come. She left behind only the faint, clean scent of lavender and the signed document that would bind them for life. He filed it away, dismissing her entirely. She was now simply another obligation met, another column balanced in the great ledger of his life. He did not know, could not have known, that the quiet woman in gray would one day become the only entry in his world that held any true value. Destiny, a patient accountant, was already beginning its audit of his soul. But before our lovers' fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and redemption, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now let the story begin. The chapel at Ashford Hall had never seemed so vast, nor its stone walls so cold, as it did on the November morning Eleanor Vance became Eleanor Thorne, Duchess of Ashford. The ceremony was an affair of obligation, attended by a scattering of family who came because propriety demanded it, and society figures who came to witness the Duke finally do his duty. Not a single soul was there for love. Eleanor stood at the altar in a cream silk gown that had belonged to Elias's mother, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame. She repeated vows that felt like signing away the last remnants of the girlish dream she hadn't realized she still harbored. She had accepted the terms with open eyes, yet some foolish corner of her heart had whispered that he might, in time, come to see her as more than a contractual necessity. She glanced at Elias as the vicar droned on. His profile was carved from marble, beautiful and utterly remote, his jaw set with the grim determination of a man undertaking an unpleasant but necessary task. His thoughts, had Eleanor been able to read them, would have offered no comfort. He was calculating timelines. How long before she might conceive? How many months until an heir secured the succession? How soon he could return his full attention to the estate's hemorrhaging finances? The woman beside him was a blur of cream silk and nervous breathing, as indistinct as she had been in his study. When he placed the ring on her finger, his touch was brief, impersonal, and he did not meet her eyes. He felt nothing beyond a sense of completion, of one more critical step taken toward securing his family's legacy. The wedding breakfast that followed was a stilted affair of forced pleasantries and knowing glances from guests who understood precisely what sort of marriage this was. Eleanor smiled until her cheeks ached and said all the right things, all while feeling utterly alone in a room full of people. She was a ghost at her own feast, a silent partner in a public performance. When the last guest finally departed and twilight settled over the estate, Eleanor found herself standing in the Duchess's chambers, her chambers now. Silent maids moved about, preparing the room for her wedding night. It was lovely, decorated in shades of blue and silver, but it felt as cold and impersonal as everything else in this house. It was a beautiful cage, exquisitely furnished but devoid of warmth. Elias came to her after full dark, entering through the connecting door with the same businesslike manner he brought to all his affairs. What followed was respectful, careful, and technically correct in every way. He fulfilled his husbandly duty with the efficiency of a man checking an item off a list, never cruel, but never warm. His hands were impersonal, even in their most intimate moments, moving with a practiced detachment that chilled her to the bone. When it was finished, he rose, adjusted his dressing gown, and spoke his first words since entering the room. "Good night, Eleanor." Then he was gone. The connecting door closed with a soft click that echoed in the profound silence. Eleanor lay perfectly still in the darkness, the sheets cool against her skin, and felt a single, hot tear slide down her temple into her hair. This was her life now, this beautiful prison, this cold marriage. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a routine of careful avoidance. They maintained separate lives within the same house, passing each other in hallways with polite nods, sharing silent dinners when obligation required it. Elias buried himself in estate business, leaving at dawn and returning after dark. Eleanor learned the rhythms of a household that ran without her, wandering rooms that echoed with emptiness, a duchess in name only. 2 months into her marriage, Eleanor began to understand the true scope of the neglect that had settled over Ashford Hall like dust over forgotten furniture. The estate was grand, yes, but it was a grandeur fading at the edges. Curtains were grown thin with age, carpets worn in the centers, and a pervasive chill spoke of economies made in coal. The servants, too, moved with a mechanical efficiency that was devoid of any warmth. She noticed how they startled when she spoke kindly to them, how the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, had actual tears in her eyes when Eleanor asked for her opinion on updating the linens. It seemed kindness had been as scarce in this house as heat. The staff were like well-oiled machines, polished and functional, but their hearts had been allowed to rust. Eleanor began making small changes, subtle ones that wouldn't draw Elias's attention or disapproval. She ordered fires lit in the morning rooms, chasing away the perpetual chill and making the spaces warm and welcoming. She spoke with the cook about the staff's meals and quietly authorized better provisions, believing a well-cared-for staff was the true heart of a home. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to weave a new tapestry of life within the old, cold walls. She learned the servants' names, inquired about their families, and thanked them for their work with a sincerity that was foreign to them. She treated them not as functions, but as people, and in doing so, she began to breathe warmth back into the house's lungs. Ashford Hall began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home, at least in the corners where Eleanor's quiet influence reached. The air grew lighter, the footsteps in the halls less hurried and more content. It was a gentle thaw, a quiet revolution of kindness that went entirely unnoticed by the master of the house. Elias noticed none of it. He remained buried in his ledgers and correspondence, his world circumscribed by profit and loss, debt and duty. The subtle shift in the household's atmosphere was a language he no longer spoke, a detail too small and insignificant to register on his meticulously calculated balance sheets. He saw the house, but not the home. On the evenings when they shared dinner, a concession to propriety, Eleanor attempted small conversations. "The gardens might be lovely come spring, if we engaged a proper gardener," she ventured one evening. Elias responded. not looking up from a document he was reading between courses. Another night, she tried again. Mrs. Finch mentioned the village is planning a harvest festival. Perhaps we might. If you wish, he cut in, his tone dismissive. Eleanor learned to eat in silence. She found her solace in the library, a vast two-story room on the eastern side of the house, filled with books accumulated over generations. Here, at least, she could escape into other worlds, other lives, stories where people loved and were loved in return. She read voraciously, poetry and philosophy, novels and natural history, losing herself for hours among the leather-bound volumes, the only companions that asked for nothing. It was in the library that Elias found her one evening in late January. He had entered only to retrieve a specific legal text. The fire had burned low, casting the room in shadows and amber light, and at first he thought the room empty. Then he saw her, curled in the large wing-back chair by the window, a book open in her lap, her head tilted against the chair's high back in sleep. For the first time since their wedding, he actually looked at his wife. In sleep, the careful blankness she wore like armor had fallen away, revealing something softer, younger. The firelight caught in her brown hair, turning it to spun amber and gold, where he had only ever seen it as plain. There was a gentle curve to her cheek, a delicacy to the line of her jaw that he had never registered before. His eyes fell to the book in her lap, Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Not a novel or poetry as he might have expected, but dense philosophy. The discovery was a small, sharp surprise. This quiet, unremarkable woman harbored a mind that grappled with the very nature of existence. It was a detail that did not fit his neat assessment of her. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. She was a person, he realized, with uncomfortable clarity, not merely a function. A person with thoughts and intelligence, who read Locke by firelight and fell asleep in library chairs. A person he had treated as little more than an inanimate object for 2 months. The feeling might have been shame, or perhaps the first hairline crack in the frozen walls around his heart. He found himself moving quietly across the room. He took the tartan blanket from the back of the settee and, with a hesitation that was foreign to him, draped it gently over her sleeping form. She stirred slightly, a soft murmur escaping her lips. But she did not wake. His gesture was an instinct he could not explain, an act of tenderness that defied his own cold logic. Elias stood there a moment longer, disturbed by his own actions, by the strange protective impulse that had prompted them. The sight of her, so peaceful and vulnerable under the firelight, unsettled him profoundly. He turned and left quickly, closing the library door with uncharacteristic care, the legal text he had come for still forgotten on its shelf. That night, alone in his grand, cold chambers, he found himself thinking not of ledgers or obligations, but of the gentle curve of a cheek in firelight. He was struck by the uncomfortable realization that he had been living in a house with a stranger he had married, a stranger he had bedded, a stranger he had never bothered to see. 3 months into her marriage, Eleanor woke to a now familiar wave of nausea that sent her rushing to the basin in her dressing room, her maid following with worried efficiency. It had been happening for a week now, these morning illnesses, along with a bone-deep fatigue and a peculiar tenderness that made her stays an instrument of torture. She suspected, of course, but hardly dared to name the possibility. When Dr. Albright confirmed what her body had already whispered, Eleanor felt a confusing tangle of emotions rise in her throat. There was joy, certainly. A life grew within her, a child she would love with all the affection she had stored up with nowhere to spend it. But beneath the joy lay a deep, aching sorrow, for she knew with devastating certainty what this news would mean to Elias. Not shared happiness, but simple satisfaction. She waited until dinner to tell him, enduring one of their interminable, silent meals. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork, and she had to force the words past the tightness in her throat. "Elias," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I have news. Dr. Albright confirmed it this afternoon. I am with child." For a moment his face remained impassive, an unreadable mask of aristocratic control. Then something shifted in his eyes. It was not joy, not excitement, but a look of profound relief, of deep satisfaction, as though a risky investment had finally paid its dividend. The expression confirmed every one of her silent fears, and her heart, which had dared to hope, sank like a stone. "Well done," he said, and the two words struck her with the force of a physical blow. "You fulfilled your primary duty admirably. This secures the succession." He took a sip of his wine, his mind already moving to practicalities. "I'll summon the solicitors tomorrow to update the will. We'll need to prepare the nursery. You'll require the best physicians, naturally. Cost is no object when it comes to producing a healthy heir." Primary duty. Succession. Heir. Not once did he say, "Our child." Eleanor sat frozen, her dinner congealing on her plate, each pragmatic word falling on her like a stone. She was a broodmare who had performed her function. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed, her voice impossibly steady. Later, in the solitude of her chambers, she wept into her pillow, one hand resting over her still flat stomach. "I will love you," she whispered to the tiny life within. "I will love you enough for both of us." The 4th month of Eleanor's pregnancy brought a change in Elias's behavior, though not the change her foolish heart might have wished for. He became attentive in the way a gentleman farmer might become attentive to a prized mare carrying a valuable foal. Solicitous of her condition, meticulous about her care, but never actually seeing her as anything beyond the vessel she represented. His concern was for the cargo, not the ship. Dr. Albright was summoned weekly for examinations that felt more like inspections. The cook received detailed instructions regarding nutrition appropriate for expectant mothers, with Elias personally reviewing the menus to ensure adequate sustenance for his heir. A special tonic, reputed to prevent complications, was imported from London at great expense. Every precaution was taken for the pregnancy, none was taken for the woman. He forbade her from undertaking any strenuous activity, leaving instructions with the servants to monitor her rest as if she were a fragile piece of porcelain. Yet not once did he ask Eleanor how she felt. He never inquired if she was frightened, or if she needed comfort rather than tonics. His concern was for the heir, and the distinction was a constant, painful reminder of her role in his life. Eleanor grew quieter as the weeks passed, withdrawing into herself like a flower closing at dusk. She spoke less at their infrequent dinners, stopped attempting conversations that led nowhere, and moved through the house like a ghost in her own home. Her world shrank to the library, the gardens, and the silent spaces of her own mind, where she could be herself without the weight of his indifference. The servants noticed. They whispered among themselves about the sad Duchess, who never smiled, who spent hours by the window staring at nothing. They saw how she thanked them for the smallest kindnesses, with a gratitude that spoke of a deep and profound loneliness, a hunger for any sliver of genuine human connection in her gilded cage. Mrs. Finch, who had served the Thorne family for 30 years and possessed a maternal heart beneath her efficient exterior, took to bringing Eleanor tea in the afternoons. She would stay to chat, her warm, sensible presence a balm to Eleanor's isolated spirit. In the safety of those afternoon teas, Eleanor found her only genuine companionship, sometimes allowing herself to speak of small sorrows and quiet disappointments that she could share with no one else. It was on a gray afternoon in late March that Eleanor miscalculated her own strength. She had been in the library, always the library, her sanctuary, and was descending the main staircase when a wave of dizziness overtook her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the carved banisters blurring at the edges of her vision. She reached out, a silent plea for stability. Her hand found only air. She felt herself falling forward, time slowing to a terrible crawl. In that suspended moment, her only thought was of the child, of failing even in this, her one purpose. The grand staircase, a symbol of the house's unyielding formality, seemed to rush up to meet her, promising a brutal end to her fragile hopes. Then, strong hands caught her. Arms of surprising strength encircled her waist, pulling her back from the precipice. The world righted itself with a dizzying lurch, and she found herself pressed against Elias's chest, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm beneath her cheek. For several seconds, neither of them moved, both breathing hard from the shock of it. She was acutely aware of every point of contact. His hands at her waist, the warmth of his body through the layers of fabric, the scent of sandalwood and ink that clung to him. Elias felt it too, that unexpected jolt, and it disturbed him profoundly. He had been passing through the hall when he saw her sway, had moved without thinking. The fear that had seized him was entirely disproportionate to mere concern for his heir. It was a raw, primal terror that had bypassed his intellect entirely. The realization unsettled him to his core. "You must be more careful," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, almost harsh with an emotion he could not name. He lifted her easily. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her up the stairs toward her chambers. He was acutely conscious of how she fit against his chest, of the way her hand clutched his shoulder, and he deposited her on the chaise in her sitting room, with more haste than gentleness, stepping back as though burned. For just a moment their eyes met. Something flickered in his, genuine concern, perhaps even fear, before the familiar cold mask descended once more. "Rest," he commanded, his voice once again clipped and businesslike. "I'll send for Dr. Albright." Then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him, leaving a profound silence in his wake. Eleanor sat motionless on the chaise, her heart still racing. Without quite meaning to, she touched her arm where his hands had gripped her, where she could still feel the ghost of his touch burning through her sleeve. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly. He had simply been protecting his investment. But her hand remained on her arm, and she could not quite convince her heart that the moment had been as empty as her mind claimed. As April arrived, Elias announced over dinner that they would attend the Peyton Ball. "Appearances matter," he stated, cutting his beef with mechanical precision. "We must present a united front. The town will expect to see the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, especially now that you are visibly carrying the heir." Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth, anxiety immediately tightening in her chest. The thought of being on display, a specimen for society's cold eyes, filled her with dread. She had never been comfortable in society, had always been the overlooked girl at the edge of ballrooms, the forgettable wallflower whom gentlemen's eyes slid past without registering. Now she would attend as a duchess, yes, but also as a woman 5 months pregnant in a marriage everyone knew to be purely transactional, a spectacle for gossips to dissect and pity. She would be more visible and more vulnerable than ever before. "Of course," she murmured, because what else could she say? Elias didn't notice the tension in her voice, or the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork. He was already mentally preparing for the business discussions he would conduct, the political alliances he might strengthen. That his wife might be anxious, that she might dread the exposure, never once crossed his calculating mind. Her feelings were not on his ledger. The night of the ball, Eleanor's maid dressed her with unusual care in a gown of rose-colored silk, specially made to accommodate her changing figure. The color brought an unexpected warmth to her complexion, making her gray eyes look almost luminous. The cut, while modest, somehow transformed her from forgettable to something approaching a quiet, understated elegance. For a moment, seeing her reflection, she felt a flicker of hope. When she descended the stairs to meet Elias in the entrance hall, she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or that strange stirring he had felt on the staircase weeks ago. For a moment, he simply looked at her, really looked, and thought that she appeared almost beautiful in the candlelight. The rose silk made her seem less like the invisible woman he had married and more like someone he might have noticed in other circumstances. "You look presentable," he said finally, the compliment so grudging it barely qualified as one. Whatever warmth Eleanor had felt at his initial expression died instantly, extinguished by the cold efficiency of his words. She took his offered arm, her smile a fragile, brittle thing, and prepared herself for the performance ahead. At the ball, Elias fulfilled his word about presenting a united front for precisely as long as it took to make their entrance and accept initial congratulations on the impending heir. Then, with a murmured excuse about speaking with Lord Hartwell on a business matter, he left her. Eleanor found herself standing alone near a pillar, her hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly, visibly pregnant and visibly abandoned. The looks began almost immediately. The pitying glances from matrons who understood exactly what sort of marriage this was. The whispered conversations behind fans. The careful distance maintained by those who saw her as nothing more than a duty fulfilled. She was a public symbol of a private failure, a walking, breathing contract on display for the amusement of the ton. Eleanor held her head high and smiled blandly, dying 1,000 small deaths inside. She wished she could simply disappear into the wallpaper, as she had always done before, to retreat into the comfortable invisibility of her past. But as the Duchess of Ashford, she had nowhere to hide. Her loneliness was now a spectacle. "Duty matches are always the loneliest, aren't they?" a warm voice said beside her. Eleanor turned to find an elegant woman of perhaps 40, dressed in lavender silk, regarding her with kind eyes that held understanding rather than pity. I am Beatrice Blackwood, Elias's cousin. Well, cousin by marriage. I was wed to his cousin James before James had the poor grace to fall off his horse 5 years ago." The frankness of it startled a small, genuine smile from Eleanor. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" Beatrice asked with gentle perception. "Or are you wondering if widowhood might be preferable to what you're currently enduring?" Eleanor's smile faltered. She looked away, unable to answer such a direct question from a stranger, even a kind one. The truth of it was too sharp, too painful to acknowledge aloud. Beatrice took her arm with easy familiarity, steering her toward a quieter corner. "Forgive me. James always said I had all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. But I've been watching you stand here alone, while my cold bastard of a cousin conducts his precious business, and I thought you might appreciate a friendly face." The word friend felt foreign and achingly welcome. They found seats in an alcove, partially hidden from the ballroom scrutiny. Beatrice spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had survived her own trials and emerged stronger. She spoke of her own marriage, which had been affectionate but passionless, of the loneliness that can exist even in a crowd, and of learning to find purpose beyond what others expected of you. Eleanor listened, hungry for the connection, for someone who saw her as a person. "Does it get easier?" Eleanor asked quietly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Living with someone who doesn't see you?" Beatrice's expression softened with a sympathy that was both knowing and profound. It was the look of a fellow traveler on a long, hard road, recognizing a kindred spirit. "Sometimes," Beatrice answered honestly, "and sometimes you learn to see yourself so clearly that it matters less whether others do." She patted Eleanor's hand. "Though between us, I hold out hope that Elias might yet surprise you. The Blackwood men are notoriously slow to recognize what's valuable, until they are on the verge of losing it entirely." Beatrice's presence was a balm, but as the evening wore on, Eleanor became increasingly aware of her own discomfort. The ballroom was stifling, packed with bodies and lit by hundreds of candles that turned the air thick and warm. A dull ache had begun in her lower back, radiating around to her abdomen. Beneath the layers of silk, she felt a cold perspiration gather at her temples. "Are you quite well?" Beatrice asked, her sharp eyes catching the pallor that had crept into Eleanor's cheeks. "You've gone rather white." "Just warm," Eleanor managed, though even as she spoke, the room seemed to tilt slightly at the edges. "Perhaps I should find Elias." She rose, steadying herself on the chair back, a sense of urgency prickling her skin. She scanned the ballroom for her husband. There he was, across the room, deep in animated conversation with Lord Hartwell and 2 other gentlemen. His attention was completely absorbed in whatever business matter they were discussing. He had not looked in her direction once in the past hour. The distance between them felt like a physical chasm, impossible to cross. Eleanor began making her way through the crowd, murmuring polite excuses as she navigated between clusters of guests. The distance seemed to stretch impossibly, the faces around her blurring into a sea of curiosity and false smiles. Each step was an effort, the ache in her abdomen growing with a frightening intensity. She was a ship taking on water, trying desperately to reach a distant, oblivious shore. Halfway across the ballroom floor, the ache suddenly sharpened into something else entirely, a pain that stole her breath and doubled her over. She reached out blindly for something to steady herself, her hand grasping only air as the world spun around her. The elegant music of the waltz warped into a discordant, menacing sound in her ears. The ballroom tilted violently, the chandeliers overhead wheeling in sickening circles. She could feel eyes on her, could hear the shift in conversation, as people noticed the Duchess of Ashford swaying dangerously in the center of the dance floor. "Elias." She tried to call, but his name came out as barely a whisper, lost in the music and chatter. The pain intensified, sharp and frightening and utterly wrong. Her vision darkened at the edges, a tunnel closing in until all she could see was a pinpoint of light, the gleam of candlelight on marble. She felt her legs give way beneath her, felt herself falling with a terrible, slow clarity, and then nothing. Darkness swallowed her whole. The orchestra faltered and stopped mid-phrase. The sudden silence was more shocking than any scream. For a heartbeat, the entire ballroom froze in a tableau. Dancers mid-step, conversationalists mid-sentence. fans arrested in mid-flutter. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of shared shock, a collective intake of breath before the inevitable chaos. Then, chaos erupted. Gasps and exclamations, the rush of movement as people surged forward or shrank back. The sharp clatter of a dropped glass shattering on the marble floor punctuated the rising panic. In the center of the dance floor, a pool of rose-colored silk lay crumpled and terrifyingly still. Elias heard the disturbance before he registered its cause, the cessation of music, the collective gasp. He turned, irritated at the interruption, and his eyes found the center of the ballroom. Time stopped. The world narrowed to a single, terrible point of focus. Rose-colored silk pooled on white marble, brown hair coming loose from its pins, a hand outstretched and motionless. Catherine. Something in Elias's chest seized with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. This was not concern for an heir or a calculation about succession. This was pure, primal fear, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and strikes directly at something deeper, something he had not even known existed in the carefully controlled landscape of his soul. He was moving before conscious decision, shoving through the stunned crowd, with no regard for propriety or rank. He dropped to his knees beside her, with no thought for his expensive evening clothes, or the hundreds of eyes watching him. The Duke of Ashford, a man defined by his control, was utterly undone. Eleanor, he said, and her name on his lips sounded wrong, foreign, because he so rarely spoke it. His hands hovered over her, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Her face was a ghostly gray-white, her lips slightly parted. She was so terribly, utterly still. The glittering ballroom spun around him, but he saw none of it. The devastating realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. He could not lose her. Not the heir. Her. When had that happened? When had this quiet, unremarkable woman become essential to his very existence? The question was an agony. The answer a terror he was not prepared to face. Elias gathered Eleanor into his arms with hands that trembled. Actually trembled, though he could not remember the last time his body had betrayed him with such weakness. She was so light, so terribly pale, her head lolling against his shoulder as he lifted her from the cold marble floor. Her fragility was a terrifying weight in his arms. "Eleanor," he said again, louder this time, as though the force of his voice might call her back from wherever she had gone. There was no response. Dr. Albright materialized beside him. Lord Peaton was calling for his carriage to be brought around. Beatrice's voice cut through the chaos with orders to clear a path. Elias heard none of it clearly. He carried his wife through the parting crowd, aware of nothing but her weight in his arms and the terrifying fragility of it. He felt as if he were carrying a flickering candle flame through a storm, knowing that the slightest misstep, the slightest gust of wind, could extinguish it forever. How easily this life could slip away if he did not hold on tightly enough. The carriage ride back to Ashford Hall was the longest journey of Elias's life. He sat with Eleanor cradled against his chest, one arm supporting her shoulders, his other hand pressed against her belly where his child grew, trying to feel for movement, for reassurance, for anything. Her head rested in the hollow of his throat, her breathing soft and worryingly shallow against his skin. Dr. Albright sat across from them, his face grave, his silence more damning than any pronouncement. Elias's heart pounded with a fear he had not felt since childhood, since the night his mother died. But this fear was different, more acute, edged with something that felt dangerously close to panic. He was not afraid of losing his heir, he realized with shocking clarity. He was afraid of losing her. Eleanor. His wife. The woman he had ignored and dismissed, and kept at a careful distance for 5 months. When had she become essential? When had the thought of a world without her in it become unbearable? He looked down at her face, so still in the dim carriage light, and tried to trace the path of his own transformation. Was it that night in the library? The moment on the stairs? Or had it been happening slowly all along, in the accumulated moments he had refused to acknowledge? Her quiet competence, her kindness to the servants, the intelligence in her choice of books. At Ashford Hall, he carried her directly to her chambers, refusing to relinquish her to servants or even to Dr. Albright until absolutely necessary. When the physician finally insisted he needed space to examine her properly, Elias retreated only as far as the corner of the room, standing as rigid as carved stone, his eyes never leaving her still form. The minutes stretched into eternities. His mind, usually so ordered and calculating, spun in unfamiliar chaos. If she died, if both she and the child died, it would be his fault. His cold neglect, his insistence on dragging her to that ball when she was clearly not well enough, his complete and utter failure to notice her distress. The weight of his own blindness was a crushing, suffocating thing. She had been collapsing in the center of a ballroom while he discussed grain prices with Lord Hartwell. The thought was a shard of glass in his soul. The triviality of his concerns in the face of her suffering was a condemnation from which he knew he would never recover. The guilt of it struck him with physical force, making him stagger a step back. Dr. Albright finally straightened, his expression carefully neutral. Her grace is stable for the moment. The child appears unharmed. I can feel movement. But she is severely overtaxed, possibly dehydrated, and there are signs of strain that concern me. The next few hours will be critical. She needs complete rest and careful monitoring. Elias nodded, unable to form words past the tightness in his throat. As Dr. Albright gave instructions to the hovering maid, Elias moved to the chair beside Eleanor's bed. He sat heavily, his eyes fixed on her colorless face. He reached out hesitantly and took her hand, so small and cold, in his larger one. He made a silent promise to whatever power might be listening. If she survived this, if she opened her eyes again, he would be different. He would see her, truly see her, the way he should have, from the very beginning. Eleanor woke to pale morning light filtering through her own bed curtains. Her body ached with deep weariness, and her throat was parched. She turned her head on the pillow and found Elias sitting in the chair beside her bed. The shock of it brought everything rushing back. The ballroom, the pain, the terrible spinning darkness. He looked nothing like the composed Duke. His clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked, she thought with distant surprise, almost human. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that had never existed before. A connection, tentative and fragile, but undeniably real. You're awake, he said, and his voice was rough with relief. He leaned forward, and she saw his hand twitch as though he wanted to reach for her, but didn't quite dare. How do you feel? Tired, she whispered, the single word an ocean of exhaustion. The baby is safe, he said quickly, the words a balm she hadn't realized she needed. Dr. Albright confirmed it. Strong heartbeat, good movement. You gave us all a considerable fright, but the child is unharmed. Us, he had said. The word was a small, curious warmth in the cold landscape of her fear. I'm sorry, she began, the apology automatic. I didn't mean to cause a scene. Eleanor, he said her name with surprising firmness, and this time his hand did move, covering hers on the counterpane with a hesitant gentleness. His gaze was intense, stripped of all artifice. You frightened me. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Not, you endangered the heir. Not, you jeopardized the succession. You frightened me. Eleanor stared at him, unable to formulate a response, unsure what this meant, afraid to read too much into 3 words spoken in a moment of crisis. Elias seemed equally uncertain what to do with the confession now that it had escaped. His hand remained on hers, warm and solid, but his expression was confused, as though he had surprised himself with his own vulnerability. You must rest, he said finally, withdrawing his hand with what might have been reluctance. He stood, and Eleanor thought he would leave, retreating to his separate sphere. Instead, he paused at the foot of the bed. I'll return this afternoon if you're amenable. Perhaps I might read to you. You shouldn't be alone. Then he was gone, leaving her to stare at the closed door in bewildered wonder. In the days that followed, Elias became a fixture in her chambers, a development so contrary to their established routine it would have been scandalous had anyone outside the household known. He came every afternoon, settling into the chair beside her bed with whatever book she requested, novels, poetry, sometimes the philosophy she favored. His presence was a quiet, constant weight in the room, both unnerving and deeply comforting. His voice, reading aloud, was surprisingly pleasant, deep and measured. He navigated the complex prose of her philosophy texts with ease, but stumbled occasionally over romantic passages in novels, as though the words themselves were foreign objects in his mouth, their sentiments in unfamiliar language he was only just learning to speak. The slight hesitation was more endearing than any eloquent delivery could have been. Sometimes they talked between chapters. The conversations were small at first, careful and circling, but gradually they deepened. He asked about her childhood, about the books she loved, about opinions he had never bothered to solicit before. She answered cautiously, still uncertain of this shift, waiting for the cold, remote Duke to reassert himself. But he never did. The walls between them, so carefully constructed, began to develop hairline cracks. Sometimes he simply sat in silence while she dozed. She would wake to find him still there, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. It was a look of intense concentration, as if he were studying a map to a country he had only just discovered, a look that was both haunted and hungry, and utterly lost all at once. Mrs. Finch observed these afternoon vigils with knowing smiles, making sure to bring extra tea, setting 2 cups on the table, though Elias never asked for one. The other servants whispered among themselves that his grace was changing, softening, though none could say precisely when it had begun. A new warmth was spreading from the Duchess's sick room, thawing the entire household. Elias himself could not have answered that question. He only knew that the chair beside Eleanor's bed had become the place where he felt most at ease. The sound of her voice discussing Locke or Byron had become something he looked forward to, with an eagerness that startled him. The thought of losing her had cracked something open inside him that he had kept locked and frozen for so long, he had forgotten it existed. He was changing, transforming in ways he did not fully understand, drawn toward the quiet woman in the bed by a force he could neither name nor resist. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Elias Thorne was not sure he wanted to resist at all. The safety of his emotional fortress now felt like a desolate prison. By the 6th month of her pregnancy, Eleanor had recovered sufficiently for Dr. Albright to permit gentle exercise. Elias, who now interpreted the physician's instructions with an almost comical degree of caution, announced that she should take daily walks in the garden, but only with him present to ensure she did not tax herself. The walks began as silent, awkward affairs, with Elias hovering at her elbow as though she might collapse at any moment. But gradually, as April warmed into May and the gardens came alive with early roses and blooming lilac, Eleanor began to speak. At first, she commented on small things, the progress of the gardener's work, the beauty of a particular flower bed, the way the light fell through the ancient oak at the garden center. Her observations were quiet drops of water on the stone of his silence. Emboldened by his attentive silence, she began to share more. She spoke of the books she had been reading, drawing connections between philosophical concepts and the world around them. She mentioned the household improvements she had quietly implemented, explaining the reorganization of the linen closets that had saved considerable expense. She offered her thoughts on the world, thoughts she had stored up for months, with no one to share them with. Elias found himself not merely listening, but truly hearing her, perhaps for the first time. He attended fully to her words without simultaneously calculating his own advantage. She was intelligent, remarkably so, with an incisive mind that cut through pretense. She was observant, noticing details about the estate and its people that had escaped his ledger-focused attention. And she was kind, consistently and genuinely kind, in a way that seemed entirely foreign to his experience. How had he never noticed any of this? How had he lived in the same house with this woman for 6 months and remained completely ignorant of who she actually was? The realization shamed him even as it fascinated him. He had mistaken quietness for simplicity and resilience for a lack of feeling. He had been a fool. One afternoon, as they passed a collection of stone gnomes installed by a previous, overly earnest duke, Eleanor made a dry comment about their disapproving expressions. "That one by the roses," she added, a twinkle in her eye, "looks particularly offended by the new pruning strategy. Perhaps we should consult him before making any further decisions." Elias found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced expression that felt unfamiliar on his own face. And then she laughed. It was a genuine, unguarded sound of amusement that transformed her entire face, lighting her gray eyes and softening features that melancholy had kept carefully controlled. The sound stopped Elias in his tracks. He stood motionless on the gravel path, staring at his wife, and realized with absolute certainty that he had never heard her laugh before, not once in 6 months of marriage. The thought struck him with the force of a blow. He had shared a home, a bed, a future with this woman, and had never once made her laugh. What kind of man had he been? More than the guilt, however, he felt something else entirely, a fierce, inexplicable desire to hear that sound again, to be the cause of it, to see her face light with genuine joy, and know that he had put that expression there. That night, long after they had parted for their separate chambers, Elias lay awake, staring at the canopy above his bed. His mind, usually occupied with figures and strategies, wandered instead to the way afternoon sunlight had caught in Eleanor's hair, to the intelligence in her gray eyes, to the kindness in her voice, to the sound of her laughter. He questioned when she had stopped being a function and become someone whose happiness suddenly mattered more than his own carefully laid plans. He had no answers, only the uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had shifted within him. A dam had broken, and a flood of feeling was rushing into the dry, barren landscape of his heart. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that there would be no shifting back. Elias began appearing at dinner with a regularity that surprised the servants and bewildered Eleanor. Where before he had attended perhaps twice weekly out of sheer obligation, often with papers to review between courses, now he came every evening, dressed for the occasion, and actually engaged in conversation. The silent, cavernous dining room began to feel smaller, warmer. He asked about her day, what she had read, what improvements she was considering for the household. He solicited her opinions on matters of estate management, seeming genuinely interested in her thoughts on tenant relations and domestic economy. He began to see her not just as his duchess, but as his partner, a mind as sharp and capable as his own. Eleanor was cautious at first. This new attention confused her, left her uncertain of its source or durability. Was it simply concern for the child she carried, an extension of his vigilance over his heir? She had been disappointed too many times to allow herself the luxury of easy trust. Her heart, so long neglected, was a cautious, timid thing. But Elias persisted with a patience she had not known he possessed. And gradually, like a flower turning toward unexpected sunlight, Eleanor began to open. Her responses grew longer, more animated. She offered opinions without hedging them with qualifiers. She smiled more readily, and laughed occasionally at his dry observations about the absurdities of parliamentary politics. The dinner stretched longer, neither in any hurry for the conversation to end. One evening, they fell into a spirited discussion about Richardson's novel, Clarissa. Eleanor argued passionately that Clarissa's tragedy stemmed from society's impossible standards for female virtue, that she was victimized as much by social structures as by Lovelace himself. Elias countered that while society's role was undeniable, Clarissa's own rigidity and pride contributed to her downfall. Their debate was a dance of two sharp minds, a parry and thrust of ideas that was more intimate than any physical touch they had shared. "But that's precisely the problem," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with the heat of intellectual engagement. "Why should she have to be flexible? Why should the burden of adaptation fall always on the woman, while men like Lovelace face no consequences for their—" She stopped abruptly, catching herself. She had been arguing with the Duke of Ashford as though he were an equal. Old habits of self-effacement reasserted themselves, and she shrank back slightly, expecting a cold dismissal. Instead, she found Elias smiling at her, a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed his usually austere features. "Don't stop," he said, his voice carrying an encouragement she had never heard from him before. "Please. I like seeing this side of you." The words were a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was rusted shut. He was not just tolerating her opinion, he was delighting in it. Eleanor stared at him, her heart doing something dangerous and foolish in her chest. He wanted to hear her thoughts. He liked her passion. He was looking at her as though she were not merely present but interesting, worthy of attention. Something unfurled inside her, fragile and tentative, that treacherous emotion she had thought she had buried forever. Hope. They continued in this vein for another hour, the argument ranging across literature and philosophy and the very structures of society. The servants cleared the dishes and withdrew, leaving the candles to burn low, and still they talked, discovering the pleasure of matched intellects and genuine exchange. They were not a duke and his duchess, they were two minds, finally meeting in a space of mutual respect. When Elias finally rose to retire, he walked Eleanor to her chamber door, a courtesy he had never before extended. He paused there in the hallway, the candlelight flickering between them. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice soft, "for the conversation. I find I've been starving for genuine discourse without realizing it." "As have I," Eleanor admitted quietly. Their eyes held for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them. Eleanor entered her room in a daze, her mind replaying every moment of the evening. She allowed herself, for the first time in months, to truly hope. Perhaps this marriage, born of cold transaction and desperate necessity, could yet become something more. Perhaps the man she had married was not the man she would spend her life with after all. In early June, an unseasonable cold snap swept through the region, bringing with it a persistent chill that seemed to seep through Ashford Hall's thick stone walls. Eleanor, 7 months pregnant and more susceptible to every change in weather, caught a chill after sitting too long by a drafty library window. It was minor. A slight fever, a cough. Nothing that truly alarmed Dr. Albright. But Elias's reaction was entirely disproportionate. He became almost frantic with worry, his usual composure cracking to reveal something raw and frightened beneath. He moved his entire working operation to the chair beside Eleanor's bed, spreading ledgers and correspondence across a hastily positioned table. He refused to leave her side, even when she insisted weakly that she was perfectly fine and he was being absurd. He brought her tea himself, rather than trusting servants with the task, testing the temperature with his own lips before allowing her to drink. He piled blankets over her until she protested she would suffocate, then removed half of them with reluctant concession. His fussing was a clumsy, unpracticed form of care. But its sincerity was a warmth that had nothing to do with the blankets. He read to her for hours, his voice a constant, soothing presence in the quiet room. He chose lighter fare this time, poetry and gentle novels, as if he understood that her mind needed rest as much as her body. Eleanor drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, his voice a steady anchor in the disorienting sea of her illness. On the second day of her illness, Eleanor slipped into a deeper sleep. In her fevered state, she stirred restlessly, her head turning on the pillow, and murmured something indistinct. Elias leaned closer, thinking she might need something. Her lips moved again, forming words barely louder than a breath, a whisper from the unguarded depths of her heart. "Why couldn't you have wanted me too?" The words, slurred with fever but perfectly clear, struck Elias like a physical blow. They pierced through all his careful defenses to lodge deep in his heart. Too. She had understood that he wanted the child, but could not understand why that want had never extended to her. The truth of the loneliness he had condemned her to crashed over him with devastating clarity. He had not just neglected her. He had starved her. Eleanor woke an hour later to find him still sitting beside her, but something had changed in his expression. He was looking at her with an intensity she could not decipher, something haunted and hungry and lost all at once. His ledgers lay forgotten, untouched for however long she had been sleeping. He was no longer the Duke of Ashford. He was just a man, stripped bare by a quiet, heartbreaking question. "Eleanor," he began, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a plea. Then he stopped, the words he needed hovering just beyond his reach. He was a man who had commanded armies in his youth, who managed vast estates and navigated the treacherous waters of Parliament. But he could not find the words to bridge the distance his own coldness had created, to apologize for a wound he had only just realized he had inflicted. Instead of speaking, he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in both of his. He simply held it, feeling the delicate bones and cool skin, the flutter of her pulse at her wrist. He held her hand as though it were something precious, something he had nearly lost through his own blindness, and was only now learning to value. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, confusion and cautious hope warring in her gray eyes. She did not pull away. Elias met her gaze, and tried to pour into that look everything he could not yet articulate. Apology and recognition, regret for the past, and a desperate, fragile promise for whatever future they might build together. Her fingers curled slightly, returning the pressure of his grip. They sat together in silence as the shadows lengthened and the fever broke. It was not forgiveness, not yet understanding, but it was a beginning. A tentative bridge was being built across the chasm that had separated them, one quiet shared moment at a time. That evening, in the library, the fire casting a warm glow, Elias finally found his voice. He sat beside her on the settee, closer than propriety strictly required, and took her hand. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I'm falling in love with you. Perhaps I've been falling all along and was too foolish to know it." The confession, so long overdue, hung in the air, simple and profound. "After my mother died," he continued, the words coming in a rush, "I saw what my father became in his grief. A broken man who gambled away our fortune, trying to feel something other than loss. I decided that feeling nothing was strength. I built walls around my heart and told myself it was responsible. I told myself it was safe. He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath mingling. But you, quiet, patient, impossibly kind, you picked the lock without my even noticing. You slipped past every defense I'd built, not through force, but through your simple, persistent presence. You showed me what I was missing, without ever saying a word. Now I find that what I thought was strength was actually cowardice. Real courage, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, is allowing myself to love you, even though the thought of losing you terrifies me beyond reason. His vulnerability was a gift, a complete surrender of the pride that had kept him a prisoner for so long. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in the firelight. I've wanted to hear something like this for so long, she said, her voice breaking. From the moment I signed that contract, some foolish part of me hoped. But as the months passed, I told myself to stop hoping. I thought you'd never. She couldn't finish the sentence, choked by the memory of her long loneliness. He closed the last small distance between them and kissed her. It was nothing like their wedding night. This kiss was soft, tentative, reverent. His lips moved against hers with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed, asking rather than taking, offering rather than demanding. It was an apology for every moment he had failed to see her. It was a promise that he saw her now, and would never stop seeing her. Her hand came up to cup his face, and she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of their lonely marriage. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Elias rested his forehead against hers once more. I love you, he said, simple and direct. I already love you, she whispered back. I think I have for longer than I should have. In the firelit library, their true marriage finally began. The final month of Eleanor's pregnancy transformed Ashford Hall. The change was in the air itself. Warmth had finally permeated the cold stone walls, and laughter echoed through corridors that had known only austere silence for years. Elias moved his chambers to the room adjacent to Eleanor's, abandoning the Duke's traditional suite in the far wing without a second thought. He wanted no barriers between them. They fell into the habit of talking through the connecting door as they prepared for bed, sharing thoughts about the day or simply murmuring comfortable nonsense until one of them drifted to sleep. Sometimes Eleanor would wake in the deep hours of the night, uncomfortable and unable to rest, and would call softly. Elias would come immediately, helping her arrange pillows, or walking with her slowly through the silent rooms until the baby settled. He was openly affectionate now, taking her hand as they walked, brushing hair back from her face, resting his palm against the pronounced swell of her belly to feel their child move. The first time the baby kicked strongly under his hand, his face had transformed with such wonder and joy that Eleanor had felt tears spring to her eyes. He's strong, Elias had murmured. Eleanor gently corrected, or she, he had smiled. Our child, he'd said, as though testing the words and finding them perfect. Our family. They made plans together in the evenings, sitting close on the library settee, discussing everything from the nursery arrangements to the child's eventual education. Elias solicited Eleanor's opinions on every decision, making it clear that they were partners in this, that her thoughts mattered as much as his. They were building not just a nursery, but a future, brick by loving brick. One night, as he held her, he whispered, Boy or girl, I don't care. I know I said I needed an heir, but truly, Eleanor, I only care that you both survive it. That you are safe. He cupped her face, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. Then I will spend the rest of my life making up for the months I wasted, not loving you properly. Then we live, Eleanor, truly live, not just exist, together. She believed him. The labor began on a cold January night, 3 days into the new year. Eleanor woke to a tightening across her belly that she knew immediately was different. She called softly through the connecting door, and Elias was there in moments, already alert, though it was barely past midnight. His calm efficiency was a mask for the terror she saw in his eyes. When Dr. Albright confirmed the birth was beginning, he suggested, as convention dictated, that His Grace might wish to wait in his study. Elias's response was immediate and unequivocal. He would not leave his wife's side. Propriety can go hang, he stated, his voice a low growl of protective determination. I am staying. His place was with her, and no force on earth would move him. The hours that followed were the longest of Elias's life. He remained at Eleanor's side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she had breath to hear it. He was terrified, more frightened than he had ever been in his life, but he tried to be her rock, to be strong for her when she needed his strength most. Eleanor was in agony, her body racked with pains that came in relentless waves. She gripped Elias's hand with crushing force, and he welcomed the pain of it, wished he could take more from her, wished he could bear any of this himself, rather than watch her suffer. "I'm here," he kept saying, the words a prayer, a promise, a lifeline. "I'm here, my love. I'm right here." Dawn came gray and cold, and still the labor continued. Dr. Albright's face grew increasingly concerned. Finally, as the winter sun began its early descent, Eleanor gave a final agonized push, and the room filled with a new sound, a baby's cry, lusty and strong. "A son," Dr. Albright announced, wrapping the baby quickly. "A healthy son, Your Grace." Elias barely registered the words, his attention fixed on Eleanor. But Dr. Albright's face had gone grave, and suddenly there was urgent activity. Towels that shouldn't be soaked in red. "She's hemorrhaging," the physician said quietly, and Elias's world narrowed to a single terrible point of focus. Not the son he had supposedly needed so desperately, but Eleanor. Her pale face, her weak breath, the way her eyes were drifting closed, as though sleep were pulling her somewhere he could not follow. "No," Elias said, his voice breaking on the word. He gripped her hand tighter, leaned close to her face. "Eleanor, no. Stay with me, please. I'm begging you, stay with me." His composure, so carefully maintained through the long labor, shattered completely. Tears fell unashamedly onto their joined hands as he pleaded with her, his voice raw with a grief he could not bear. "I've only just found you," he cried, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "We've only just begun. You can't leave me now. Please, Eleanor, please." His love, so new and so fierce, was being threatened at its very inception, and the thought of losing her now was an agony beyond comprehension. Eleanor heard his voice through layers of exhaustion and pain. She heard the naked fear and grief in it, felt the wetness on her hand that she realized dimly were his tears. It would be so easy to just let go, to drift into the welcoming darkness. But Elias was calling to her, his voice broken and desperate. And she heard in it everything they would lose if she surrendered now. Their son, the life they had planned, the love they had only just discovered. So she fought. With what little strength remained in her exhausted body, she fought against the darkness pulling at her. For Elias, whose tears she could feel, for their son, whose cry she could hear, for the future they deserved after such a difficult beginning. She held on to Elias's hand like an anchor, and, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, refused to let go. Dr. Albright's quick action and Eleanor's own stubborn will pulled her back from the edge. The recovery was slow, painfully so. Elias refused to move from her bedside, sleeping in the chair, waking at her slightest stir. He seemed to believe that his vigilance alone could keep her tethered to the world of the living, and perhaps, in some way, it did. He brought their son to her in those first fragile days, settling the tiny, squirming bundle carefully in her arms when she was too weak to lift him herself. He would sit on the bed, one arm supporting Eleanor, the other supporting their child, a living bastion of love and protection around his small, vulnerable family. Eleanor looked down at the small face, features still red and wrinkled from birth, and felt an overwhelming love crash over her. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears of exhaustion and joy sliding down her cheeks. "Absolutely perfect." Elias sat beside them, his arm around her shoulders, gazing at his son with an expression of pure, unadulterated wonder. "He has your nose," Elias observed, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "And hopefully your disposition. One of me in the world is quite enough." Eleanor laughed weakly, then winced at the pain the movement caused. The sound was fragile, but it was the most beautiful music Elias had ever heard. "What shall we name him?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a moment, studying the baby with thoughtful intensity. "Thomas," he finally said, "if that pleases you." "After my father?" Eleanor asked, surprised and deeply touched that Elias would choose to honor her family in such a way. It was a gesture of respect and inclusion she would never have expected from the man she had married. "No," Elias said quietly, his gaze meeting hers, full of a new, vulnerable honesty. After the father I hope to be, not the one I had. He explained his own father's coldness, his fear of emotion, and his desire for something different for their son. I want Thomas to grow up knowing he's loved, that feelings aren't something to be locked away and feared. His hand moved to cover Eleanor's where she held their son. I want to be the kind of father, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The kind of man that you have taught me I can be. In that moment, he was not just naming his son. He was christening a new legacy for the Thorne family. One built not on duty, but on love. In the weeks that followed, as Eleanor slowly regained her strength, their little family took shape. Elias was a devoted father, constantly amazed by every small detail of his son. But more than a devoted father, he was a devoted husband. He told Eleanor daily that he loved her, the words coming more easily with repetition, but never losing their profound weight. He was rebuilding their foundation, one declaration at a time. He brought her flowers from the conservatory, read to her during her convalescence, and sat with her for hours, simply talking or existing in a comfortable silence that was more intimate than any conversation. He was making up for lost time with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed her, as though he were determined to compress a lifetime of affection into every single day. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat in the window seat, nursing Thomas while Elias watched from a nearby chair, she asked him something that had been on her mind. "Tell me the story," she said softly. "Tell me how this happened. How we got from there," she gestured vaguely, indicating the cold study of their first meeting, to here. Elias smiled, that full, warm smile that still surprised her. "Once upon a time," he began with gentle humor, "there was a foolish duke who thought he had everything figured out. He thought he could order his life like a ledger, keeping everything controlled and predictable. He thought that if he never allowed himself to feel anything, he could never be hurt." He rose and came to sit beside her, his arm going around her shoulders. Then a quiet, patient woman came into his life, and she was everything he didn't know he needed. She was kind where he was cold, open where he was closed, brave where he was cowardly. And though he was too stupid to see what was right in front of him, she waited. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You saved me," he said seriously. "I was barely alive, just going through the motions. You taught me how to feel again, how to love, how to be human instead of just a collection of duties and titles. You showed me that a heart is not a liability to be guarded, but a gift to be shared." Eleanor leaned into his warmth, their son sleeping peacefully between them. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just loved you, even when you couldn't love me back." Her simple, unwavering love had been the steady flame that had finally thawed his frozen heart. "That's everything," Elias said quietly, his voice full of reverence. "That's the whole story. You loved me until I learned how to love you in return." And in that simple summary, the entire complex journey of their two hearts was perfectly, beautifully contained. Spring arrived at Ashford Hall with an explosion of color and life that mirrored the transformation within the estate's walls. The gardens, which Eleanor had quietly arranged to have properly tended, now burst with daffodils and early tulips. She stood on the terrace one warm April afternoon, stronger now, watching Elias play with their son on a blanket spread beneath the ancient oak tree. Thomas was 3 months old now, beginning to smile and coo, and Elias lay on his stomach beside him, making absurd faces that sent the baby into fits of delighted gurgling. The sound of her husband's laughter carried across the garden, and Eleanor marveled at the change in him. The man who had once seemed incapable of joy was now so full of it that it spilled over into everything he touched. The estate itself was flourishing. Servants smiled as they worked, singing sometimes when they thought no one was listening. Fires burned cheerfully in every occupied room. Flowers graced the tables. Everything had color now, where before there had been only gray. Eleanor knew the change was not merely in the estate, but in how she saw it. Happiness had painted over the loneliness that had tinted everything in those early months. Elias looked up, caught her watching, and smiled. That particular smile he reserved only for her. He rose with fluid grace and crossed the garden to where she stood. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair, and she could hear the smile in his voice, the deep contentment that had replaced the cold calculation that used to define him. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Eleanor admitted, leaning into his warmth. "That first day, when you slid that contract across the desk, I thought I was agreeing to a lifetime of loneliness. I thought I would spend decades in this house being invisible to you." The memory was no longer painful, merely a marker of how far they had come. Elias's arms tightened around her. "I was looking," he confessed quietly. "I was just too afraid to see. Afraid that if I let myself feel anything, attraction, interest, affection, I'd lose control. My father fell apart after my mother died, and I was so determined not to be like him that I tried to feel nothing at all." He turned her gently in his arms, so they faced each other, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I didn't understand then that love doesn't make you weaker. It makes you stronger, braver. It gives you something worth fighting for, something worth living for, instead of just existing in careful isolation." His eyes shone with the absolute truth of his discovery. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones. "You made me better, Eleanor. You made me human again. You made me want things beyond duty and obligation. You made me care about something more than just preserving a legacy." His gratitude was a living, breathing thing between them, warm and constant. "You made yourself better," Eleanor corrected gently. "I just gave you a reason to try." "You were the reason," Elias insisted, his voice low and fierce with conviction. "You are the reason for everything." He needed her to understand the depth of her impact, the totality of her importance in his life. He kissed her then, slow and sweet in the spring sunshine, while their son gurgled contentedly on the blanket nearby. Ashford Hall stood solid behind them, no longer a prison of cold duty, but a home filled with love and laughter and the promise of all the years ahead. It was a testament to their shared journey, a monument to a love that had refused to be denied. Eleanor rested her head against Elias's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She thought about how far they had come from that gray autumn morning, how close they had come to missing this entirely. She was so grateful that he had learned to see her before it was too late, and that she had been patient enough to wait for him to find his way to her. "Come," Elias said, taking her hand. "Thomas is going to start wondering where we've gone, and I want to show him how his mother looks in the spring sunlight. It's my favorite view in all the world." His love was no longer a guarded secret, but a declaration he made freely, in the warm light of day. Eleanor laughed and let him lead her across the garden to where their son waited. As she settled on the blanket with her family around her, she thought that perhaps difficult beginnings made for happy endings, that were all the sweeter for having been so hard-won. Their joy was not a gift, but a victory. 3 years had passed, and Ashford Hall had been transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its former austerity barely recognized it. The estate was prosperous, but more than that, it radiated warmth and life. A daughter had joined their son, little Eleanora, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, barely a year old and already ruling the household with imperious infant demands. Thomas, now 3, was a serious, thoughtful child. On a warm summer afternoon, Elias and Eleanor walked together through the gardens while their children played on a blanket nearby under a nurse's watchful eye. They moved hand in hand, comfortable in the way of couples who had weathered storms together and emerged not just intact, but stronger. Their fingers laced together with unconscious ease, a silent testament to their enduring bond. At the dinner parties they now hosted with genuine pleasure, people remarked on the Duke and Duchess of Ashford. They spoke of how devoted they were, how obviously in love. The gossips who had once pitied Eleanor now whispered with romantic satisfaction that the cold, practical union had somehow become one of the great love stories of their generation. Elias still remembered with crystalline clarity the moment Eleanor collapsed, the rose-colored silk pooling on white marble. The memory could still fill him with retrospective terror. But more than terror, it now brought gratitude. Gratitude that she had collapsed when she did, shocking him out of the emotional paralysis he had mistaken for strength. Gratitude that she had been patient enough to love him even before he knew how to love her back. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, noticing the distant expression on his face. He smiled and pulled her closer. "Just remembering how blind I was, how close I came to missing all of this." "But you didn't miss it," Eleanor said simply, her hand squeezing his. "That's what matters." "We found our way," he corrected, his gaze soft and full of love. They continued their walk while their children's laughter carried across the garden and the summer sun warmed the earth. Everything was exactly as it should be. Not perfect, perhaps, but real, and hard-won, and infinitely precious. Dear listener, sometimes the greatest transformations come not from grand gestures, but from quiet moments of awakening. A woman asleep in a library chair, a hand caught on a staircase, A collapse on a ballroom floor that forces us to confront what we've been refusing to see. Elias thought he needed an heir to secure his legacy. But what he truly needed, though he didn't know it, was Eleanor. Someone to pick the lock on his guarded heart with patience and kindness. Perhaps you know this feeling of having what you thought you wanted, only to discover that what you actually needed was something else entirely. It takes courage to open your heart when you've convinced yourself that staying closed is safer. It takes patience to see the potential beneath a quiet surface. It takes wisdom to recognize that the practical choice and the heart's choice need not be different things, if only we are brave enough to let transformation happen. Remember that people are capable of profound change when given the right reason, the right person, the right moment of clarity. And sometimes that reason is the quiet, steady love of someone who sees past your carefully constructed walls to the person you could become, if only you had the courage to try. May you find, or be, that reason for someone. May you have the courage to let transformation happen, even when it frightens you. Rest well, dear listener, knowing that even the coldest hearts can learn to warm, and even the loneliest souls can find their home. Know that it's never too late for new beginnings, and that the person you thought was just a means to an end might actually be the purpose, the meaning, the reason for everything.